So far, then, we've looked at two really important questions. The first one is, why does your research matter? Why is it that it needs to be communicated? The second thing that we've looked at is what it is that you're going to communicate, what your story is. We've looked at how you can shape your research in a number of forms of different kinds of stories. And we've paid attention, or we've noted the way in which the shape of the story carves out a need for the story itself. It tells the reader why the reader wants to read your story. So it does some of the work of the why it matters, as well as shaping what it is that you're trying to tell people. So we've done the why, we've done the what, and in this final section, let's just look at some more practical considerations in terms of writing your article itself. The first thing I want to do then that might be helpful is just to explain the process from submission to publication of an article, in case you've got any doubts about how that works, or there's any mystery about it. So sometimes authors take a kind of very preliminary stage, which is where they write directly to the editor of the journal and say, hey, I'm writing an article about this, would you be interested? And I would always recommend doing that. Why not? There's a lot of journal websites will have a kind of quite fierce and off-putting instructions about, you may only submit through this portal and don't contact us, and you are mere pond life, and we're the journal, so go away and don't bother us. And I would say just drop the editor a line with a title of your journal, of your article, and the abstract, and ask them, hey, is this the kind of thing that you would be interested in? It may be that you have misidentified a relevant journal, and they might just write back and say, sorry, this isn't the kind of thing that we do, in which case you've saved yourself 4 months of waiting for a reply, and so forth. You can tell a lot from their reply. If they're really enthusiastic, that's a really good opening. If they seem a bit offish or they're really slow to reply, that is a bit of a bad sign, and you might want to think about going somewhere else. If they're very snobbish and they don't reply, that's that's a warning sign, I would say. So in general, I would say, why not drop the editor a line and say, is this the kind of thing you're interested in? The next thing that happens at that point is that you will send in your article, or more likely upload it onto a very, very tedious web interface. At that point, then the article will go to the editor of the journal, and they will make an initial judgment. At BJHS, I would say that I immediately weeded out about 50% of articles at that stage. My attitude as an editor was that reviewing journal articles properly is very time consuming. It's a big favor to ask of people, and I didn't want to send people articles unless I was really confident that there was something in that article that made it likely to be publishable. 50% perhaps sounds quite harsh as an initial sweep. Of those, I would say about half of them were just bonkers and were easy to take out, and the other half were just clearly had misjudged the content of the journal. They were philosophical articles rather than historical, or they were completely contemporary, or just in some way I could just kind of smell that they were not really appropriately academic. A lot of amateur history coming in that just wasn't really appropriate. So about half, in my experience, about half the articles submitted will go on to peer review. Typically they'll be sent out to 2 peer reviewers. The standard model is the peer reviewers don't know who you are, and you don't know who the peer reviewers are. The peer reviewers don't know who each other are either. Although that is beginning to change, because of course with social media it's pretty, you know, if you want to as a reviewer, you can pretty quickly figure out, find on social media, you know, who it is that's likely written the article. And indeed, you know, the academic world is a small place, and you know, if you're working on a very kind of small and specific topic, the chances are you know the experts in that field, and they may also know you. So it's worth bearing in mind that, you know, you probably can make a reasonable guess, you know, at least the kind of the group from amongst which the peer reviewers will have been selected. Those peer reviewers will then reply to the editor with their yes, their no, their maybe, and they will fill in a form, or they will be asked specific questions depending on the journal, and they will give answers. And what the editor is hoping for is a really clear answer from both of those reviewers, and for it to be the same clear answer, either yes, this is great, just tweak it a bit, or no, definitely not. Usually you'll get something in the middle. Usually you'll get a maybe, and the two peer reviewers will have they'll both have different things that they want done to make it publishable, sometimes completely contradictory things. So one will say take out X and make it more Y, and the other will say take out Y and make it more X. If it's a good editor, they will, rather than just kind of giving you those reports and like good luck reviewing it, usually if they're a good editor, they'll give you a steer through those, you know, bit more of this, bit less of that. There might be a little hint in there as to which reviewer they'd like you to pay more attention to. But it is hard steering between those, and it's really difficult sort of not to take it personally, or to sort of attribute some kind of agency to the journal itself. Well, what do they want? They want this and they want that. Well, it's two different people. You know, the journal is not an intelligent agency. The journal doesn't have a wish. You know, if you do have really contradictory reviews, you can always ask the editor, you know, these seem to contradict. My inclination is that I would like to do more of this, but then there'll be less time for that. And see if you get a steer from the editor in that respect. At the end of the day, the editor doesn't really care. They just which way you take it. There are probably two possible good articles in there. They just want something that makes sense and is interesting to the readers, and, you know, is a decent piece of scholarship in itself. And maybe there's another article in there that you can send somewhere else. So you will make your review. You might need to, you know, it might be quite substantial. You might need to go away and do a bit more research, or it might just be a question of rewriting, a bit more reading the secondary literature, and you will send your revised version in. And then it's up to the editor. The editor might just look at it themselves and go, yep, I think they've covered what my reviewers wanted, or they might be a bit uncertain about it, and then they might send it back out to either or both of the original reviewers. Things get messy occasionally if there's a change of editor, or for whatever reason one of the reviewers drops off the scene, and then it ends up sort of going through a third or a fourth pair of eyes, and then you can end up with quite contradictory things that you're being asked to do. Breathe. Try not to get annoyed. The journal is not out to get you. All the editor cares about is that what comes finally back is something that is coherent and worthwhile, not that it should have sort of ticked particular people's boxes along the way. And then hopefully at that stage, the editor will make a final decision. Sometimes you rinse and repeat a few times around the cycle. If the editor thinks there's something good in there, but it really needs a lot of work, you might go around the review and rewriting process a few times. But hopefully the second time they will be ready to put it into print. And it then goes, so you then tidy it up. Make sure all your picture captions and your acknowledgements are in place. Obviously, that's the stage at which you de-anonymize it, and then you submit it to the publisher. It should, if it's a decent journal, then go through a process of copy editing, and you will receive a number of, you'll either be sort of invited to accept editorial corrections, and then the press itself will also have author queries for you in terms of proper nouns, dates, weird things in the footnotes that you've overlooked, all that stuff. In terms of the percentages, my experience as an editor was 50% immediately rejected. Of the 50% that are left, I would say again another 50% of those would be knocked out at the reviewing stage. Of those that get through the review stage, probably about 2/3 of them will make it into print. Maybe 1/3 will not, even at the resubmission stage, will not be judged satisfactory. Okay. Let me show you the form that I used as an editor of BJHS. I hated online submission, so we did everything back and forth by email. These are the questions that I asked my reviewers to think about. Some of them would answer the questions very diligently, some of them would just ignore them and write an essay. That was fine. I was happy with any. But I think, in general, these are the kinds of questions that any journal will be asking its reviewers. So these are the things you need to bear in mind as you write. What you should be seeing here is a grid with a series of half a dozen questions, and then reviewers are invited to tick either yes, definitely, pretty much yes, not really, or no. By giving 4 answers, I was always trying to force my readers to either a positive or a negative, trying to discourage them from sitting on the fence. And you'll see that again, well, my final question is your gut instinct to publish? And there's only 4 options. Yes, with minor revisions, most likely yes. Invite revision and we'll see, and no. So again, trying to push them to a clear yes or no, although inevitably most of them would come back with 2.5. Okay, so first question that you need to be thinking about is, does this paper advance knowledge or understanding in its specific field? So you should be really, really clear what is the claim that you are presenting. By the way, I should add here, of course, there's no rule that says you can't ask around to find someone who's reviewed recently for a journal that you're submitting to and ask them what were the questions they were asked, so you can make sure you are addressing the concerns of that particular journal. The answer to that question should usually be a clear yes. The harder question is the second one. Does this paper have interest to history of science readers outside its specific field, or insert your own specialism? So if you're a literary scholar, to literary scholars in general, or if you're a philosopher, to philosophers in general. The journal that I edited was general within the history of science, and so it's really important that it reaches beyond the very niche area that it's in. If you really can't think of a reason for someone outside the very specific niche to read it, then make sure you send it to a very, very specific journal. And again, this comes back to the point I made in the previous session. Remember that everyone is a lot less expert than you think. Not everyone has been absorbed in this topic for 3 years like you have. You need to persuade them of why it's interesting to them. But also, it means explaining more things than you might naturally be inclined to. It's always better to over-explain than to under-explain. And remember too that journals cut across national backgrounds and age backgrounds. So make sure that you explain everything. Not everyone knows what the Peterloo massacre is, or Rickrolling, or whatever. Next important question is, well, the next pair of questions is essentially about the balance between primary and secondary materials. So in history, that would be archival sources and historiography. In philosophy, that would be your own case studies or thought experiments and what other philosophers have written. It's really, really important to get the balance right between too much and not enough discussion of secondary sources. And ditto, it's really, really crucial that you get the balance right between too much and not enough of academic jargon, and a lot of early career researcher papers need work on this, and sort of they tend towards putting in unnecessary academic jargon where ordinary English would do. Our friends and I have got a really brutal classification system that we sometimes apply to academic talks and seminars when we're sitting there together. And we classify them as either as too much, relates to the phrase grist for the mill, which is kind of, you know, stuff to think about or stuff to process. So either we say too much grist and not enough milling, meaning, well, the writer told us a bunch of stuff, but where was the analysis? Or too much milling and not enough grist, meaning clever arguments, fancy talk about methodology, but where was the actual stuff? Where was the actual research? Where was the actual evidence? And I wish there were an app that enabled you to sort of measure and check your balance between the primary and the secondary resources that you've got in your work, but there really isn't one. But here are a few hints. So a good basic pattern is to use your introduction to talk about what scholarship has inspired you in writing your paper, either because it's about a similar topic or because it has employed a method or an approach that you have found particularly helpful. After the introduction, mention of these scholars need only be lightly threaded through the article. The purpose of the article is not to prove that you understand those scholars. That's what your PhD is for. Nor is it to justify their work as such. I always think of this as being a little bit like one of those fantasy dinner parties that they always put in celebrity questionnaires. Who would you invite to the table to talk about your research? Explain who and why in your introduction. And then if you think that they'd interject at a particular point in your narrative to wave their fork and say, yes, I agree with you, or no, or but that's not like this case study, then put that in as an aside or a footnote. Top tip, use your first footnote very astutely. By this, I mean the footnote that says the most previous work on this topic is by Smith and Jones and blogs, with the titles of those books or articles. If an editor is stuck for contacts in your field of expertise to use as referees, they are going to go to that footnote and work their way down the list. So start with the people whom you would like to act as your reviewers, people whom you think will give critical but positive and constructive feedback. The next item on my box is about whether or not the paper presents a clear and convincing line of argument. And it's surprising how many papers fall down on this point. It's really the crux of what we've been discussing in the first two sections of this session, explaining what your story is and the journey that you're going to take the reader on. You cannot be too explicit about it. Put it in the abstract, and again in the introduction, and put it briefly again in the conclusion. I always recommend having working subtitles that are in the form of questions. For example, what does the evidence from X show about Y? Or what counterexamples were there in those decades? And so forth. By answering these questions, you are effectively creating mini arguments that will hopefully bolt together to create one bigger argument. Later on, you can change the subtitles so they don't sound quite so basic. The next question asks whether the structural elements of the paper are appropriately and effectively used. A few basics on this. First, aim to write fewer words than the journal specifies as its word limit. A good 10% less. You will surely overrun, and at least one of the referees will add you to ask something extra. So leave yourself headroom. I've already talked about using questions as your subheadings. I also recommend using topic sentences to check the structure of your work. So as you remember, topic sentences are the first sentences, usually in every paragraph, that tell you what the main point of that paragraph is going to be. A really good kind of quick check you can do on your work is to copy and paste just the topic sentences of each paragraph together. When you do that, you should have like a mini reduced version of your article that makes sense to read through in order. You could try even just doing that with the topic sentences of each section rather than every paragraph. Eventually, you might want to move that topic sentence to, say, the second sentence of the paragraph so you can have a more literary opening, but make sure you can follow those rules before you break them. This is probably too obvious to state, but check the guidance to authors and follow the protocols of the journal. For example, do they use sub-subheadings or not? And for their headings, are they numbered or are they just named? How long is a normal section in the journal article? How many sections are typically present in an article? Do they use footnotes? Do they use endnotes? Don't go over the top. You know, a good paper will never be rejected for a slip up in the format, but if it's a borderline paper, it's not going to be helped in its chances if the formatting looks sloppy, because that makes you look like a sloppy scholar. Finally, is the paper well written in good English prose? And here I recommend that you cultivate friends who are prepared to be critical and prepared to be dumb. Prepared to be critical, that they really will say this sentence doesn't make sense. Don't stick. Anyone who says this read fine to me has not read it properly or is perhaps not capable of reading it critically. It takes two people to produce a good piece of prose. You cannot easily edit your own prose. Find someone who will rip your sentences to shreds. And critically, find someone who's prepared to be dumb. Someone who's prepared to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what this means. I'm sorry, I don't understand what this sentence is saying. I'm sorry, I don't understand the point of this whole section. Often, I think it's best to make friends outside the humanities. I think within the humanities, within your own field, another reader, they might be embarrassed because they might think that they look silly if they don't understand what you've written. And I think quite often we're unwilling to do that. So find a friend who's an engineer or works in a bar or something, and they are prepared to be dumb and say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying here. That is what is really, really going to help you. So I hope that checklist was useful to you. As I say, that is fundamentally the list of questions that any journal will be asking about your work. So if you can address those, you'll be doing okay, or if you can find the precise way in which your target journal asks those of its reviewers. Let's spend our last chunk of time thinking about the abstract, which is probably the most important thing you will write, followed by the introduction. The initial impression counts for so much. I often remind students of the law of advertising. If you're advertising in the cup final, the FA Cup final, advertisers will pay more for the first advert and for the last advert in the block, because those are the two that audiences will remember. And the same is true about your paper. The editor will take notice of the abstract and the introduction and the conclusion, and those are what will stick in their head and kind of dominate their response. A good abstract will do three things, which we have already discussed at length in this session, albeit under slightly different headings. A good abstract will explain what the paper is about, how you will go about it, i.e. what methods you're using and why, or what case study have you focused on and why is this the key to telling us what the paper is telling us. And finally, the first part of the session, why it matters, why the reader should care about this, why the readers of this journal should care about this. So what, how, and why. You can address these in any order. So exercise 3, write an abstract. If you're ready, have a go at a 250-word abstract for your paper, addressing the what, the how, and the why. If not, analyse the abstracts of the 2 articles you've chosen to identify these elements. If they're not present or could be clearer, try rewriting them to make them better. And just a few, before you move on to that final exercise, just a few final thoughts for you. And these are fundamentally thoughts of encouragement. Don't take rejection personally. Try not to. It's so hard. I remember the first journal article that I wrote and sent off and was rejected, and it was a body blow. Sometimes a journal has a massive backlog and they're rejecting papers that are really brilliant. The editor will never tell you that. You know, you could have a pair of really great reviews, it seems to you, and they've still rejected it. And you're like, why? Maybe they just have got a massive backlog. You should think of your reviews as kind of like rolling a pair of biased dice, right? Dice that are sort of more kind of biased towards the 4, 5, 6. If your paper is good, you ought, by chance, to roll, you know, 2 scores of 4+, but you might not. You know, even biased dice can give you the wrong answer. A paper can be rejected for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes one of the reviewers randomly takes objection to something you've said and it colours their entire view of the paper. They're offended not to be cited. You can always tell them if they say you failed to cite bloggins on this and bloggins on this and bloggins on this, reviews by bloggins. You probably don't want to work with them. Or just having a really bad day and they've written you a nasty review. An editor might not feel confident or have the subject specific knowledge to override their reviewers, or normally they write helpful reviews and they don't want to annoy them, they want to keep them for the future. So all kinds of things can happen to your paper. If it's rejected, doesn't mean it wasn't a good paper. Maybe you just sent it to the wrong journal. Do remember though, if you then send the paper, if it's been rejected, to another journal in the field, it's very likely to be sent to one or maybe even both the same reviewers. Like I was saying before, it's, you know, we all work in small fields, so be aware of that. A second shot might just annoy the same reviewer again. So don't take it personally. Be encouraged. Writing is really hard work, and writing for publication is different from writing for a PhD, but it's a joy to feel like you've accomplished something good, and it's an amazing feeling when it gets published. So keep at it. Remember that writing is not a solitary experience. You need to talk to identify your story, and you need someone to be a co-pilot in your writing. And the law of karma is that doesn't work for you unless you do it for someone else. So go out, make friends, work together, be published. Good luck.